This move opens lines for the queen and a bishop while immediately contesting central space, setting the stage for a wide variety of strategic and tactical battles depending on black's response. This move prepares to open the diagonal for the queen's bishop and establishes a solid pawn structure, often leading to the solid French defense, which aims for a robust kingside defense and queenside counterplay. This move establishes central pawn control, directly challenging black's e6 pawn and preparing to develop pieces to active squares, aiming for an open and dynamic game. This move, challenging white's central pawn immediately, leads to the sharp lines of the open Sicilian defense, aiming to create an unbalanced pawn structure and active piece play for black. This move develops a knight towards the center, prepares for kingside castling, and importantly, challenges black's central pawn structure by indirectly attacking the c5 pawn. This move, 3, cx-d4, initiates the main line of the open Sicilian defense, immediately challenging white's central pawn presence and opening the c-file for black's pieces. This move recaptures the pawn and initiates the main lines of the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, leading to dynamic play where white aims to exploit a central space advantage and black seeks counterplay on the queenside. This move, known as the Kahn variation, aims to prevent white's queen-knight from developing to b5 or c4 and simultaneously prepares to expand on the queenside with b5. This move develops another knight towards the center, supporting the central pawns and preparing for castling while maintaining pressure against black's flexible pawn structure. This move develops the queen and prepares to castle kingside, while also contesting white's control of the d4 square and hinting at a future b5 pawn advance. This move initiates the fianchetto variation, aiming to develop the bishop to g2 where it will control the long diagonal and support the center. This move develops a knight towards the center, prepares for castling, and supports the d5 square, a key central outpost in this variation of the Sicilian defense. This move develops the bishop to a strong diagonal, preparing for castling and potentially supporting a central pawn push or future queenside expansion. This move develops a piece towards the center and prepares to castle, adhering to fundamental opening principles while maintaining flexibility in the pawn structure. Castling kingside secures the monarch and connects the rooks, preparing for central play and potential pawn advances on the kingside or queenside. This move solidifies black's pawn structure in the center and prepares for further development, potentially aiming to challenge white's central control and develop the queen's bishop. This move prepares to support the central pawn push d4-d5 and potentially activate the rook on the e-file, which will likely become open as the game progresses. Developing the bishop to d7 supports the central pawns and prepares to castle queenside, anticipating white's potential kingside attack. This move initiates an exchange on c6, simplifying the position and opening the d-file for white's rook while creating a doubled pawn for black on the c-file, which will require careful management. Capturing with the b-pawn creates an asymmetrical pawn structure, opening the b-file for potential queenside pressure and retaining more pawn presence in the center, compared to an a-pawn recapture. This move solidifies white's queenside pawn structure and prepares to develop the light squared bishop to a more active diagonal, reinforcing the central control. This move develops a key piece towards the center, preparing to castle and reinforcing the pawn on e6, while also eyeing the central squares which will become more active after white's b3 pawn push. This pawn thrust challenges black's central control, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and create potential weaknesses around black's king should it advance further. By capturing the pawn, black opens the d-file for their rook, which can now exert pressure along this critical central file, while also challenging white's central pawn structure. Developing the bishop to a powerful diagonal, b-flat-2 aims to pressure black's central pawn structure and support white's e5 pawn advance. Castling kingside is a standard defensive maneuver in this position, securing the king and connecting the rooks for future action on the open central files. This move prepares to contest the central e-file while simultaneously supporting the pawn advance on e5 and potentially activating the queen. This move initiates a central pawn race and introduces dynamic tension, aiming to exploit the potentially weakened pawn structure after white's e5 advance. This exchange of knights strategically simplifies the position by opening the d-file for black's rook and creating a doubled pawn on c6, which can become a long-term weakness in black's queenside pawn structure. This pawn capture opens the e-file for white's rook and creates a doubled pawn for black on the d-file, potentially weakening its structure. This move exchanges a bishop for a knight, eliminating black's central knight and opening the e-file for white's rook, while also creating a passed pawn on d5 for black, which must be closely monitored. This move recaptures the pawn and prepares to develop the bishop, aiming to challenge white's control of the d-file and potentially create attacking opportunities on the queenside. This exchange simplifies white's position by eliminating black's central pawn and opening the bishop's diagonal, aiming for greater piece activity. This recapture is strategically sound, simplifying the position and freeing the queen to develop an active role while avoiding the potential threat to the d5 pawn that could arise from the bishop on b2. This move boldly challenges black's pawn center, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and potentially create weaknesses in black's kingside. This move on *b6** repositions the bishop to a more active square, directly challenging white's central pawn majority and preparing to contest the open c-file with its rook. Rad1 aims to control the open d-file, supporting the advance of the c-pawn and preparing to exploit white's central pawn majority. This move expands on the queenside, aiming to create an outpost for the knight on b4 or to provoke a reaction from white's pawn structure. This central pawn exchange simplifies the position, opening the c-file for white's rook and potentially creating weaknesses in black's queenside pawn structure. This move recaptures the pawn, creating a passed pawn for black on the d-file, which will require careful attention and potentially lead to an endgame advantage if successfully advanced. This move centralizes the rook on a stable square, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially support a kingside advance with f4. This move initiates an aggressive pawn storm on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain space by creating an advanced passed pawn or forcing concessions. This move aims to create central pawn tension and potentially open lines for white's rooks, while also restricting black's queenside play. This move aims to activate the A pawn by creating a passed pawn threat, potentially forcing white to commit their bishop and allowing black to establish a better defensive setup or counterplay on the queenside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the open c-file and potentially coordinate with the rook for pressure along that important diagonal. The move Rab8 prepares to contest the b-file, which has been opened by white's pawn advances and rook maneuvering, aiming to neutralize white's pressure and potentially create counterplay. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, preparing to contest the open c-file and potentially support a central pawn push or reinforce the queenside. This move prepares to challenge white's control of the c-file, aiming to equalize the pawn structure and potentially create counterplay for black's pieces. This capture on the third rank opens the a-file for white's rook, aiming to exploit the doubled pawns and potentially create pressure along this semi-open file. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, eyeing the weakened light squares on white's kingside and preparing to support potential pawn advances or piece activity. This move repositions the rook to the third rank, aiming to support potential advances on the queenside and contest the open c-file, while simultaneously preparing for a possible exchange on the d3 square or reinforcing the center. This move prophylactically prevents white's knight from penetrating to g5 and reinforces the king's safety before black commits to further pawn advancements or piece maneuvers. This capture removes black's strong bishop and opens the d-file for white's rook, aiming to exploit the vulnerable d5 pawn and potentially create an attack on the king. This move recaptures the bishop, simplifying the position and eliminating white's strong central pawn majority while opening the d-file for black's rook. The capture on d5 clears the d-file for white's rook, creating immediate pressure on black's queenside and aiming to exploit the pinned knight if it were to move. This move is a desperate attempt to create immediate counterplay by forcing a perpetual check, as white's king is exposed after the queen exchange. This move activates the king from the immediate danger of the check and prepares to defend the pawn on g2 while also clearing the way for potential rook activity on the first rank. The move 29, kh7 is a prudent safety maneuver, tucking the king away from the potentially dangerous open a-file and centralizing it slightly, preparing for a more active role in the endgame or potential defensive maneuvers. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, threatening to double rooks on the d-file and creating potential pressure on black's queenside pawns. This move initiates a powerful tactical sequence by exploiting the weakened light squares around white's king, forcing a favorable exchange and aiming to create a mating attack. This checks the king and forces a queen exchange, simplifying the position and aiming to leverage white's rook activity on the open c-file. This move creates a safe square for the king, preventing further checks on the g-file and preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside to improve the king's shelter. This rook sacrifice clears the 7th rank, aiming to create an unstoppable passed pawn and exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king. This move sacrifices the rook on g1 to create a dangerous mating attack against the white king, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside after the rook moved to g1. This king move aims to escape the immediate discovered attack along the g-file and centralize the king to potentially participate in the defense or later counterplay. Black's queen captures a pawn, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially create counterplay on the queenside, though it invites white's rook back into active play. This rook move prepares to contest the open c-file and potentially pressure black's queen while consolidating white's material advantage and centralizing the rooks.